Hello and welcome. We will be talking about industry evolution and strategic change today. A couple topics here. We're going to talk about what's called the industry life cycle. We're then going to look at what the challenges are and why, when industries go through different phases of their life cycle, organizations can really struggle to adapt. And we'll look at some strategies for managing adaptation and strategic change over the course of an industry life cycle. So the industry life cycle is an idea that's adopted from marketing. You might be familiar with the product life cycle, and it looks at the same dynamics, the sales of the industry over time. Now, obviously, these aren't cumulative sales. They're sales over some period, annual sales, say, or quarterly sales. And essentially, there's two drivers here. There's the growth of demand, which is reflected in the sales, and there's the creation and diffusion of knowledge, which is sort of less obvious here, but in theory is the thing that's driving some of the competitive dynamics that we're going to look at. Innovation, product and process innovation takes different characteristics over the industry life cycle. If we think about product innovation, it is going to be at its peak at the start of the industry. That's when the new product is getting released. That's the thing that starts the whole industry life cycle. And that does taper off with this kind of S curve over the life of the industry. But at the same time, in the red there, you can see that process innovation starts very low, but it peaks at about the maturity. If you think back to the industry life cycle we were looking at there, process innovation kind of mirrors that life cycle. Process innovation picks up as we reach maturity and then declines as the industry declines. And process innovation, whereas product innovation refers to things that go into the product, new features, new technologies, that increase willingness to pay and sort of represent a bit of a experimentation, trying to find the right feature set for the product that customers want. Process innovation is really about getting the cost down and getting increasing scales. So as the process innovation happens, most of that innovation is creating economies of scale and reducing the cost of production. How typical is the life cycle pattern? Technology-intensive industries tend to sometimes repeat these patterns. You can see televisions there. Other industries will reach maturity but not decline, right? Food processing, construction, haircuts, things that we need all the time, the funeral industry. And sometimes they'll experience regeneration. So in the case of televisions here, each time you had a new technological innovation, it kind of relaunched the product life cycle. Or with motors here in the 50s, there were some innovations. Think about Honda introducing a smaller motorcycle engine and the Japanese motorcycles. That's where this kind of takes off again. Japanese motorcycles, such as those from Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, sort of caused another increase in the motorcycle life cycle. Here's some examples of innovation and renewal over the life of the retail industry. Starting off in the 1850s, we have department stores would have been maybe mainly concentrated in urban areas and probably just catering to the more wealthy parts of society. In the 1900s, we get the mail order catalog. Now we're targeting rural America and lower income households. And as you can see here, there's really, as we go across these different business models or renewals of the retailing life cycle, the companies change by and large. So we get Sears, Roebuck coming in the mail order renewal of that retail innovation. Then we get to chain stores, right? Retail chains rather than just big department stores that are only in certain cities. Then we get to discount stores, an innovation, sort of an innovation in the chain store that goes sort of down market a bit more. Then we get warehouse clubs, even further discounted, more economies of scale. Category killers, those are our big box stores that we still have a lot of. That's kind of the main retail store, I'd say now. You get your Best Buy, which just does electronics. You get Home Depot, Lowe's, every different product category now, you almost might say, has its own store. Bed Bath and Beyond, right? We very rarely go to strictly department stores anymore because of this new business model. They can compete on scale, give a better price, etc. This is a great slide to pay attention to because it discusses the dynamics of different aspects of strategy and different industry factors, you might say, over the industry life cycle. So at the top there you have demand. That's the most obvious. It's described right in that first graph. But who the demand is coming from rather than volume of demand in this case. So at the introductory phase you have what we call early adopters. As it grows and proceeds into the growth phase, we get increasing market penetration, more people and more demand is coming online. Maturity demand is really represented by replacement or repeat buyers, and they're price sensitive. Think about televisions, flat screen TVs. Nobody here has probably bought their first ever flat screen TV this year. They're replacing it, buying, repeat buying. And then in decline, it's usually because it's gone obsolete. Think of cassette tape players. You can still buy them, but it's a pretty small market. Technology, at the beginning of the life cycle, it's competing technologies, different ideas, different ways of meeting consumer demand. In the growth phase, you start to move towards standardization and process innovation to pump it out faster. For the first phase here, think about HD DVD versus Blu-ray. Those were competing technologies offering the same thing, high definition video. When you get to maturity, it's diffused know-how. It's called incremental innovation. Think about smartphones here. The smartphone industry, I'd say, is mature. Each new generation of iPhones really isn't offering anything particularly innovative at this point. Slightly better cameras, slightly more memory, slightly faster processors. How do products change? At the beginning, you get quite a wide variety of features and designs. If you think about early automobiles, you had all sorts of, if you've ever seen those videos of early types of aircraft, there were all sorts of different designs for aircraft. Even dirigibles and zeppelins and blimps and everything, but that really moved towards a sort of Boeing 737 Airbus design, which is what we have now in aircraft. In the growth phase, design and quality improve, and what's called the dominant design emerges. So in commercial aircraft, that would be the Boeing 737 sort of design there. In maturity, it becomes commoditization, and now it's differentiated on brand more than features. And in the decline, differentiation becomes difficult because it has completely become a commodity and everyone's competing on price. Manufacturing across the industry life cycle, at the beginning you have short runs because you don't want to place any big bets when you're not sure what demand is going to look like. It's very hard to forecast demand. It's very skill intensive because you're making these short runs, so it's much more reliant on labor and less on capital. As we enter the growth phase, we have capacity shortage. All of a sudden demand skyrockets. We can't get them onto the shelves fast enough. Think about new Xbox consoles or PS5 when that was released. The demand comes online and they really couldn't scale up quickly enough. We moved to mass production. As we hit maturity though, there isn't as much demand. That demand has sort of peaked, and now we get overcapacity where we start to have problems with covering fixed costs and really possibly some challenges, some exit barriers, because firms will start to compete even when they're making a loss because they just want to cover their marginal costs and they have more capacity than the market demand can meet. And then in decline, we definitely have overcapacity. Trade, just generally speaking, production shifts from advanced to emerging countries. The new product tends to initially be made in the country that came up with where the R&D was happening. Think about Tesla starting off in California, and then production moved over to China. Competition at the beginning, introduction phase, there's only a few companies, the ones that sort of the first movers. As it grows, we have more entries, as well as exits and mergers, and then usually quite a few companies at this stage. And then at maturity, we have a shakeout. Demand has stabilized. There's only room for a few competitors, given the increasing economies of scale due to process innovations. And then in decline, we have price wars and exits. Key success factors in introductory stage, it's definitely product innovation, coming up with and trying to capture as much demand as possible and figure out the dominant design. When we get to growth, we get what's called design for manufacture. Let's standardize components so that we can reduce the cost of production. When we get to maturity, it's all about cost efficiency, scale economies, cheapest possible inputs, let's buy at scale. And then in decline, we're just looking for low overheads and rationalization. We don't want high fixed costs because demand is dwindling. What drives, or what are the main drivers of industry evolution? First of all, customers becoming more knowledgeable and experienced. They start to have knowledge about the product. They know it exists. Diffusion of technology on the supply side, and demand growth slowing as market saturation approaches. This is sort of looking now vertically rather than horizontally. So the top there is at the introduction, the middle, diffusion of technology. So customers becoming more knowledgeable is introduction, diffusion of technology at maturity, and demand growth slowing is sort of maturity decline. I won't go through all of this because it would be repetitive and not terribly interesting to watch, but I leave it to you guys to read and make sure you really understand what's going on here. This slide is interesting as it shows, and you guys might not be, it was surprising to me, it shows the industry life cycle in terms of the number of competitors over from introduction, growth, and maturity for the car industry. It may surprise you to know that at one point in 1915 there were 250 American car manufacturers. So 1895, the industry is just being introduced. You have some early adopters, some rich people buying, rich crazy people buying these new cars, and then that takes off. It's really over the course of 20 years. And then we have that shakeout here in 1925, really then 1935 until present day. There's really three main, the big three auto manufacturers. This gets at performance across the stage of the industry life cycle. So you have a bunch of different metrics here. Some of these might be familiar to you guys even from that. If you've read the article on whether vertical integration is profitable, some of these metrics are identical to the ones they use to measure performance. And you can see basically vertical integration is happening. Companies are becoming more vertically integrated over the product life cycle. There's much more technological change early on, much less later on. Percentage of sales from new product, almost by definition you'd expect that to be true, that it would be by the time you get to decline it's not a new product, so that's kind of what we say tautological. It's true by definition. More R&D is happening. R&D over sales is called R&D intensity. That's obviously highest at the growth phase. Age of plant and equipment, again, this isn't very surprising. By definition, the plant and equipment is older during the decline phase because it's been there for longer. More investment is happening at the growth phase. More advertising is happening at the growth phase, but that actually stays somewhat constant, or at least it doesn't decline as much. Perhaps that's interesting. Because you start to fight it out over brand rather than the product, so you have to continue advertising. Why is it hard for companies to adapt to change over the industry life cycle? Few reasons here. Organizational routines. Companies develop routines, people develop routines, and it's difficult to, those have inertia that is hard to get away from. Social and political structures. You end up having managers overseeing certain areas, what we talk about silos in organizations. The political structures meaning that people have authority in certain areas over their staff that they manage and over resources, and obviously they don't want to give that up. And oftentimes change requires shifting people, both financial and human resources, to different departments, and those who currently have them aren't going to let those go easily, generally speaking. Although if we think about that core competence article, this is one of the key things that needs to happen to adapt. Conformity, we talk about, there's this term institutional isomorphism, which is basically the research shows that a lot of managers, when they want to know what to do in terms of strategy, they just look at what all their other friends are doing at their organizations or all their peers in other organizations and do the same thing. So you kind of get a bit of groupthink that stops, even between companies, that stops managers from implementing change. We have limited search. Bounded rationality is a term from a behavioral economist called Herbert Simon, where he said, sort of the rationality assumed in classical economics is too strict. He said people are try to be rational, but they have limited information and limited capacity to process information. They're human beings. They're not perfect. They're not computers. And so this bounded rationality means that managers tend to just conduct local searches for change. So they tend not to go off with blue sky thinking, finding some new radical innovation. They tend just to, when they do change, it's usually something close, incremental change. It's close to what they're already doing. They haven't looked far and wide. They kind of look close to what they're already doing and make incremental, satisfactory solutions rather than optimal solutions, where those optimal solutions might be quite radical. Complementaries between strategy, structure, and systems. It's very hard to change your strategy because strategy tends to have informed the structure and vice versa. The structure of an organization and its systems tends to be devoted to a particular strategy. If you want to change your strategy, you have to change the whole structure of the organization. Restructuring is very difficult, as is systemic change. And this kind of gets at some of the earlier points there. Organizational routines are sticky. Social and political structures have vested interests. So it's kind of a summary of all of these. You might say in a word that as human beings, we tend to be change resistant, or there is a lot of change resistance in humans. To show you just how difficult change is for large organizations, large incumbent established organizations. Incumbent means they're already there, they're the market leaders. If you look at the top companies in 1912, none of them are in the same list in 2018, interestingly. So being the largest organization 50, 100 years ago is no guarantee of being successful in the future, or now, and likewise being the largest company. You know, the obvious implication here is if we look at this list from 2018 or today at the largest companies, well, how many of those will be there in 50, 75, 100 years? It's very hard for organizations to change as industries evolve. Some types of technological change are more difficult to adapt to than others. There's 3 different bullets here, and they're all really getting at the same thing. I'll go through them. One author has come up with what they call competence enhancing versus competence destroying change. Another one has come up with this idea of architectural versus component innovation, finally sustaining versus disruptive technologies. They all get at the same idea, which is that some types of technological change can be adopted by the incumbent firms without much trouble and might even benefit them. Whereas other types of change really cannot be approached using the same structure, same people, same organization. I don't care which of these terms you use, they all mean the same thing largely. Some of them are more obviously applicable. Architectural versus component innovation kind of sounds a bit more detailed. And the example I like to use here, automobiles. A new component innovation would have been the fuel injection that replaced the carburetor however many years ago. That didn't destroy the automobile industry. They were still using the same architecture, an internal combustion engine, but they just had to change one component, which was fine, and it probably increased demand and benefited the industry. It was a feature customers liked. Whereas EVs, the electric engine, that has been an architectural change. It changes everything under the hood of the car. And as it turns out, the core competence of most auto manufacturers isn't the ability to put a frame on four wheels, it's what's going on under the hood. And if you look at which companies are doing best in the new EV world and market, there's really no incumbent car makers. Ford has tried and done very badly. GM has tried and not done well. Nissan tried with a car called the Leaf. Who are the big EV manufacturers? Tesla, BYD. Firms that are completely new and weren't previously incumbent auto manufacturers. So pretty well supported. Another example might be the move to streaming video versus brick and mortar video rental, right? Blockbuster was given the opportunity to buy Netflix for $55 million in 2000. They turned it down. Blockbuster is gone now. It was the new firm, Netflix. Even though they didn't start off in streaming, they had a different subscription-based business model that had customer information on the internet. They were the ones who captured the streaming business model, although they're now being displaced by video studios that are forwards integrating into streaming, which is interesting. Different ways to manage change. There's this idea that firms need to have a strategy that exploits their existing opportunities. We're talking about incumbent firms now, but also a strategy that prepares them for tomorrow. This has been called ambidexterity. Exploit existing resources and capabilities while simultaneously exploring new opportunities. And so there's two ways to do this, what's called structural ambidexterity. This is where you have what's sometimes called a skunk works department. I think Ford actually calls, one of the analysts in the Ford earnings call talks about their EV division as a skunk works. That's where you put all the crazy scientists and engineers, and you don't impose the same budget constraints that you impose on your existing business or the same structural constraints. You kind of have to siphon them off and manage that whole creative, exploratory line of business differently. Google did this with Alphabet. Facebook did this with Meta. Interestingly, at a certain point, Google decided to make Alphabet the parent company once it had become successful enough, and they believed that was the way the future was going. Contextual ambidexterity, you can't see it here unfortunately, but the idea is you don't do anything with the structure, you don't separate people into new units, but you just have people doing both at the same time. This is probably more appropriate in an industry where just people are always exploring the next thing, right? As part of their daily work. Think about Apple, think about chip companies. Part of using today's resources is always looking ahead, and everyone's doing exploitation and exploration at the same time anyways, so that works. But if you have if your industry is very mature, you're going to need to have probably a different structure that lets others explore new industries, just because you have to manage them differently. Different ways of combating organizational inertia. The first one comes from Jack Welch at GE, create a perception of crisis. In your culture, let people know that they need to be always moving forward and exploring new things. This idea that your business is always at risk. Establishing stretch targets, right? Use performance management to incorporate exploration towards new initiatives. Organizational initiatives by the CEO. Jack Welch at General Electric launched a thing called Destroy Your Business, where staff could try and come up with ideas that would destroy their existing line of business that they were working in the company. And if they were successful, if the idea got chosen, they'd get some budget to go and run with that idea and explore it some more. Fairly obvious one, reorganize the company structure. If change is coming and sometimes you need to shake things up, move people around to combat that inertia. New leadership is really structural change as well, but just at the top. Maybe you need to bring someone over from the industry who's familiar with the industry change that's happening. Apple did this with their AI efforts. They hired an AI executive from Google, although so far it hasn't really produced great results. And finally, scenario analysis. This is something that comes from the military, but big companies do it all the time as well. It's kind of like a brainstorming session where you come up with, okay, what are different things that could happen, ranging from the quite likely to the black swan unlikely events that would be devastating if they did happen, though, and figure out what would we do, what would be the impact of each of these scenarios, and how could we best respond. One of the interesting aspects of change is that a firm's existing capabilities are very heavily rooted in their early history, perhaps not surprising. There's a bunch of examples here. I won't go through them all, but the imprint of the founder, founding CEO or founder of the company, and their early experience of the company, whatever it was they did to start, that inheritance often lives on in the company. Summing up a lot of this here, the idea is that if you want to create new capabilities in an organization, new capabilities, you have your existing resources, that base of resources, and then you use 4 levers: processes, structure, motivation, and alignment, to create and integrate new capabilities needed to meet the change. This is an example of how Hyundai built capabilities from a very small resource base and capability base, where they were just, Hyundai started off in the 60s just assembling Ford kits. It's called a knockdown kit, right? You'd get a sort of a car in a crate, and you put it together and sell it in the local market in South Korea. But they built on that, eventually made their own chassis, made their own bodies, and just used Ford engines. With the Pony, with the Excel, they started doing more. They were doing some of the control systems, steering perhaps, assembling the engines, the cam assembly. Finally, they created their own engine in 1985, building on these capabilities again over time, until sort of present day, when they have their own proprietary models that they really are fully integrated now and do the whole research and design and car manufacturing. So you can see how companies started from very small beginnings in '68 and built those capabilities over time. I'm not going to go too much into dynamic capabilities. One, because they're almost impossible to measure, and two, because I'm not sure how, partly for that reason, I'm not sure how useful the concept is, but it's good to know that there is this concept in the strategy literature. A guy called David Teese came up with this idea of dynamic capabilities, and he basically said the capability to create new capabilities is what he calls dynamic capabilities. So a dynamic capability is the ability to have new capabilities. It's kind of like the ability of a firm to learn new skills and new capabilities. I'm not going to get into Gary Hamel, although you may have, if you're in the 525 course, you will have seen his article on core competence. I think that's him. I'm not going to get too much into knowledge management either in this course. Learning theories of the firm would take us down a whole nother rabbit hole, which are interesting, but the paper and the theory behind it is very complicated. I'm not sure how useful it is for applying to what we're doing in this course. It even as a PhD, looking at learning theories of the firm was fairly taxing, and unless that's your area of specialization, I don't know that it will serve you particularly well. So yeah, we'll conclude there. Looking forward to seeing you all next lecture.